Welcome to the Indigo Podcast, an exploration of human flourishing at work and beyond. I'm Ben Barron of Indigo Anchor and Cleveland State University.
And I'm Chris Everett of Indigo Anchor. For more information, please visit us at www.indigopodcast.com. All right, so today we're going to talk about sense-making, leadership, and COVID-19.
That's right. So today we're going to talk about what's called the collapse of sense-making and a way in which organizations and our institutions around us are fragile. We're going to talk about how to lead the charge and how individuals and organizations can support. And then we're going to talk about some emerging new tasks and roles for management due to COVID-19. It just seems like such a relevant thing for us to address here today. And I want to give a big shout out to Cliff Scott. Cliff Scott is a professor of communication studies and organizational science at the University of North Carolina at Charlotte. He was on my dissertation committee and introduced me to many of the different pieces of literature that we're going to talk about today. So Cliff is awesome, and we'll also probably talk about something that he has a little bit that he posted on the UNC Charlotte website about key principles for leaders to communicate during crises. So let's go ahead and jump right in. What do you say, Chris?
Yeah, so now I know who to hate for giving you a PhD, right? Well, at least one of them.
Yes, you know one of them, I suppose.
I said, yeah, it's a group effort. So the collapse of sense-making, and this is a way in which organizations are fragile. And I think we've seen that fragility. Now, that fragility is more than just, okay, all of our employees are fired and shutter the door, right? You know, rounding the wagons is actually a reasonable response sometimes. But we're actually seeing things fall apart that's not just circling the wagons. So we hear a lot of stuff about these companies should have planned, right? And that's a sense-making property. So people are sensing that they know everything that organization faced or came through. Let's say your deal was to, you only had 2 months of operating expense because you just opened your company, right? So sometimes we can plan for these contingencies, but other times you just get hit. I mean, if aliens were to land tomorrow, are we going to stone people for saying, where was your alien contingency plan?
Probably, but you're right. Sometimes we definitely can plan for some contingencies, and we should. This is why business continuity plans and other types of scenario planning is very, very important. But there are times in which the unexpected happens, things that we truly can't imagine. And even if we can think through, for example, the effects of a pandemic, something like COVID-19, it's very difficult for that message and for that understanding of what it could imply for everyday life to really be absorbed by everyone. I would say COVID-19 is kind of, in this category of getting hit by a truck out of the blue, despite all the warnings that certainly experts have given us for years about our lack of preparedness for pandemics, right?
Right. And when you look at entrepreneurs, could you imagine them going to a venture capital raise and let's say traditionally they only needed like $10 million or something, right? And they're like, oh, well, I need 60 million. Well, why do you need 60 million? Well, 10 to get the thing off the ground and an extra 50 to survive like a zombie apocalypse that might occur for a 3-year period of time. I don't think anybody's going to hand you any cash to run a company, right?
Well, right. Well, and the uncomfortable thing that we have to all reconcile with is that we are always making trade-offs. We are always making trade-offs between things like, efficiency and preparedness, things like, safety and, gas efficiency. So for example, we could probably make aircraft with, so much reinforcements and out of certain types of materials that they could probably withstand a lot of crashes. And yet we can't do that because then they would be so darn heavy and so inefficient that it would be crazy to even try to run them. So we are always making these kinds of trade-offs. And we certainly do this in organizations because we can't plan for everything. And I think it would be impossible to do that. And pandemics are one of those things. I think after this all starts to settle out and so forth and becomes more of the new normal, it probably will be more relevant and salient to people, obviously. So it will get baked into people's preparedness plans and so forth. But I really think it's unfair to say that everyone should have, imagined what this would be like. I think, experts certainly have been talking about this type of contingency for years, but it would have been very difficult, if not impossible, for people kind of across the board to truly imagine the scale and scope of what we are experiencing right now around the world, at home, at work, how it's going to really influence your daily lived experience, so to speak.
Right. But the cool thing is when I start to see these should have done this, that should have happened, what is going on here? These are flags, my consultant mind, gets awakened, right? This is people trying to make sense of their environment. And there's this idea that how we act in the world, right? And this comes out of the literature and philosophy, honestly, that how we act in the world creates a stack of meanings that lead to some kind of sensible response from the environment. And that's because we interact in our environment a lot, and we do have a bit of control, right? So, nobody's concerned when they walk out their front door that gravity's going to stop working. So we have some of these, constants that going, but sometimes stuff that's so far out of our reality and scope happens. And, I'll hear stuff where people are attributing meaning where it probably doesn't exist. Everything happens for a reason. Well, sometimes that reason is a butterfly flapped its wings, 1,000 miles away a year ago or something, right? There's just this chaos that can happen as part of our world. And so if you were out on the moon, let's say, you get beamed over, you're in a spacesuit and you're there on the moon, and a rock landed, 20 feet from you. Because that's an environment that you're not super comfortable with, or as usual, you don't have those stacks of meanings in your head, it's doubtful you'd be like, that rock landed there for a purpose. I'm supposed to write, an epic book or something like, that's not the kind of thing that'll happen.
Sure. So I think the key here is that these types of extraordinary events, when they happen, they can lead to what we call a collapse of sense-making within our organizations, within teams. And this is when there's a total paradigm shift in our ordinary way of thinking. And, the ways in which we normally solve problems maybe don't work. So there's some great literature that we're going to be talking about today. There's a lot of this comes from Carl Weick, and Carl Weick is he's a professor emeritus from University of Michigan and an organizational theorist. Has done a lot of work on crises and this whole idea of sense making, how we understand the world around us and how we deal with it. And there's an article.
He's genius. If you are not familiar with his stuff, go read all of it. This is the guy on this stuff. One of the main guys. Yeah.
Sure. And, there's this article that we'll talk about, probably a little bit more in depth here in today's episode, where he's basically analyzing this event that happened a number of years ago, where there were smoke jumpers that were attempting to fight a fire in Montana, I believe. And he talks about this idea that there are these things that happen in which our complete way of understanding the world changes. And I think a lot of us have experienced that in the last couple of weeks. And he calls it a cosmology episode. And I don't want to get too much into the weeds in terms of kind of why he calls it that. But he says this is something that occurs when, and I quote, people suddenly and deeply feel that the universe is no longer a rational, orderly system. What makes such an episode so shattering is that both the sense of what is occurring and the means to rebuild that sense collapse together. Stated more informally, a cosmology episode feels like vu jade, the opposite of deja vu. Right? And I continue quoting. He says, "I've never been here before. I have no idea where I am, and I have no idea who can help me." And I think that, that's kind of the extreme example, and maybe some of us haven't gotten there yet in terms of what's going on with COVID-19. But I think there are moments when, especially people who are on the front lines of this and people dealing with it, have certainly felt like this, right? This is a new reality that we're having to make sense of, and this is different from other things that we have experienced, which is what makes it so disorienting for many people.
Yeah. So I had Vujade events for us, 9/11, right?
Yeah.
Katrina.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know, certain technology innovations, like when the internet got turned on in everybody's houses, they were like, oh my gosh. It used to be that like people would be isolated broadly. Their exposure to the wider world came through like media outlets and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
But now they're actually talking to somebody. And I think a lot of people thought, oh, well, most people are kind of like me. They just maybe dress a little differently or eat a different food. And then they're scandalized to realize, oh my gosh, these people think totally different than me. The paradigm changes. Terrorism was something that happened overseas, when I was a kid. You'd hear about those things on maybe NPR or something. You'd be like, man, those guys are really upset over there. You just didn't have any frame of reference. But when the Twin Towers came crashing down, right, all of a sudden, okay, well, what's this terrorism thing about, right? Your paradigm and scope of the world shifts.
That's right. And it's interesting you bring up terrorism, because I think that is kind of the threat that we certainly as Americans have kind of gotten used to dealing with and have reconciled to some degree with it being a reality since 9/11. Now, 9/11, goodness sakes, was now almost 19 years ago. And what seems to be an appropriate response in the face of terrorism oftentimes is something like defiance. It's, you know what? We're not going to let this scare us. We're still going to go out shopping. We're going to go about our lives. We're going to, take the fight to where it needs to be.
We
and
don't
so forth.
negotiate with terrorists, that kind
right.
of, yeah.
Right. And I wonder, and so this is not an original thought. Someone on Twitter posted this, and I just thought it was good. I can't find it, but it was really good. Just this idea that maybe, because we've been so ingrained to think about the threat as terrorism, and that this response of defiance is something that's seems to be appropriate in that context. People in some ways are using that as a frame to try to understand something like a pandemic, and that doesn't work, because we can't say just go about your lives. We can't say, oh, we're gonna beat this thing, get out there and go to the movies, right? That doesn't work. That frame of reference, that way of understanding reality in the world, is inappropriate given the current reality, and therefore we are facing this new way of thinking, this sense that we've never been here before.
Right. The military deals with this. That one of the critiques is we're always fighting the last war. Mm-hmm. And so many ways our organizations and our cultural ways of organizing, neighborhood, town, city, that kind of stuff, generally is set up to fight the last war, whatever that is. Now, it becomes really hard. So if you take something like the military, okay, we're fighting in these environments where, it's small unit warfare, terrorist events, bomb trucks, that kind of thing, versus what we call conventional warfare, would be like, you line up your tanks on that side, I'll line up my tanks on this side, and ready, go at it, right? But that being said, we've been fighting the war on terror, as they call it, for so long that some of these conventional warfare skills have kind of perished. And it's just the way we think. You only have so much resource, people, training methodologies and stuff, consciousness raising, like, hey, we got to also remember and train on fighting with traditional force on force type stuff. It becomes a challenge. So, and our organizations have these same challenge. What should you gear your organization up for? How do you make those kinds of shifts?
Right. Yeah, and this idea of fighting the last war is I think one that is really appropriate here because we use those prior frames of reference to try to address those threats or challenges that we have now, and that's fine as long as those challenges are similar, but oftentimes they aren't, or sometimes they aren't, and when they aren't, we can really get ourselves into trouble. So if we treat, for example, COVID-19 like a terrorism attack, in all those different ways of being defiant and so forth, that's not going to work very well. And there's, I think, a bias that we sometimes have towards, trying to think, oh, this is like this thing, and therefore I should treat it that way. But sometimes things are completely different, and we have to question ourselves to make sure that we're not falling into that trap.
Right. And so the cool thing about this, and we can start shifting over to talk about how to lead the charge and how individuals and organizations can support leading that charge in a correct response, is your person or your organization may not have had all the sense-making stuff in relation to a pandemic. That being said, there are experts that have been out there exploring this stuff. Anytime there's a major event, like there were counter-terrorist experts well before 9/11. And so event happens and then all of a sudden you're going, what do we do? They pull these experts out of the closet and thrust them out there. And so same thing here. Wyke is one of the experts on sense making and then what you need to do to build your resilience from there.
Right. So maybe now we could turn our attention towards discussing, this article that he wrote, and this has been around for a while. He published this in 1993, but I think it's still very relevant to what we're talking about here today. And this article is called "The Collapse of Sense-Making in Organizations: The Man Gulch Disaster." So there was a forest fire, a fire that was occurring out in the middle of nowhere in Montana, but it needed to get dealt with. And a group of smoke jumpers took off to go fight that fire. And this was actually in 1949. Very hot day in August of 1949. And these smoke jumpers went out to fight the fire. They went out there, via an aircraft, and they started moving towards the fire, started evaluating what was going on. They initially evaluated this as, a fire that they were going to be able to probably be able to beat within, the next day, and, kind of a no big deal type situation. And what Carl Wyke does in his article is he analyzes this situation based upon a book, actually, that really goes deep into the actual event called Young Men and Fire, and kind of analyzes it through this paradigm of organizational theory and teamwork and so forth. And what was interesting, what happened in this situation is that these smoke jumpers, they're starting to go through their day, and they're starting to, kind of evaluate how they're going to attack this thing. But then something changes, and I think it's worth quoting here from Carl Wyke's article. And he is in this quote, he's also quoting a few times from that book, Young Men and Fire. But what Carl Wyke writes is he says, "At this point, the reader hits the most chilling sentence in the entire book. Then Dodge saw it." So just as an aside, Dodge was the leader of the group. What he saw was that the fire had crossed the gulch just 200 yards ahead and was moving toward them. Dodge turned the crew around and had them angle up the 76% hill toward the ridge at the top. They were soon moving through bunch grass that was 2.5 feet tall and were quickly losing ground to the 30-foot high flames that were soon moving toward them at 610 feet per minute. Dodge yelled at the crew to drop their tools, and then, to everyone's astonishment, he lit a fire in front of them and ordered them to lie down in the area it had burned. No one did, and they all ran for the ridge. 2 people, Sally and Rumsey, made it through a crevice in the ridge unburned. Hellman made it over the ridge, burned horribly, and died at noon the next day. Dodge lived by lying down in the ashes of his escape fire, and one other person, Joseph Sylvia, lived for a short while and then died. The hands on Harrison's watch melted at 5:56, which has been treated officially as the time the 13 people died. End quote. So he's talking about this incredible kind of paradigm shift that's occurring. This guy saying, hey, everyone's trying to run up this hill, trying to get away from the fire. And the leader says, drop your tools, so you can run faster. And he also lights a fire in front of him to basically create an area that was already burned. And then he gets down and lies in it. And he says, hey, get in here with me. And they don't. And they go on, and most of them die. So it's this fascinating event. And then Carl White goes through and talks about how this is an example of the collapse of sense-making and all these different ways in which they failed to understand what was going on. I think these lessons are so relevant to all of us when we're dealing with the unexpected, when we're dealing with things like a pandemic, that we take some lessons from these types of events.
Yeah, I don't know a whole lot about fight. I mean, I don't know anything about fighting fires, right? And so when I was reading the "Here's What Happened" stuff, it was like, what do you mean he's lighting a fire? Like, I could not make sense of all these events. Now, these guys are, experienced firefighters, well, way more experienced than I am. So, they had different types of sense, but some of them were, they just ran for it. Forget you and your crazy fire. I'm heading for the hills, right? And we see stuff like the collapse of group thinking or group decisioning and different qualities of decisioning. But the main piece is something crazy had happened. They thought the fire was easily manageable. It quickly became unmanageable. And then there was different qualities in the way that they interacted and sensed what to do.
Right. And so, this episode today is all about sense-making and leadership within this new context of COVID-19. And so we want to unpack this idea of sense-making a little bit. So there's a number of ways to think about this, but it's this basic idea is that we are in an ongoing way trying to understand and make sense of everything around us, right? We do this retrospectively. We do it about, hey, what already happened. And there's a great quote here from another article by Morgan, Frost, and Pondy, and it says that individuals are not seen as living in and acting out their lives in relations to a wider reality, so much as creating and sustaining images of a wider reality. In part to rationalize what they are doing. They realize their reality by reading into their situation patterns of significant meaning.
Yeah, so people start this sense-making thing, and we're prone when you're in that chaos world where nothing makes sense, everybody's operating kind of off their own sheet of music. Experts will start to project stuff onto it. People might come up with just, the fantastic. This just has some purpose. And those aren't bad things. We've got to tap into all of those. So there's this idea of bricolage, right? Ben, what is bricolage?
Right. So now we're kind of moving into how we can perhaps lead the charge and how individuals and organizations can support, right? How can we deal with all of this and how can we make sense better? So bricolage is this idea that we can make do with the things around us, that we can put together pieces of our environment that maybe weren't used for certain purposes, but now we're going to repurpose them. Some examples of people doing this right now. We have whiskey distillers who are starting to make hand sanitizer. I was reading a great story about, I think it was an anesthesiologist who also had an engineering background who made some changes and advances in ventilators so that they could be used with more than one person at a time and so forth to really maximize that. Some really creative types of activities that can happen in the midst of a crazy event like COVID-19. I'm kind of akin to, lighting that fire to escape another fire, like happened in this incident back in 1949 at the Man Gulch disaster. People are coming up with creative ways to do this. And what is important is that as a leader, in a situation where you're facing the unexpected, where you're facing the truly paradigm-shifting type of environment like COVID-19, you have to create the conditions under which improvisation and bricolage, creativity can flourish. If you don't, you truly run the risk of treating this like something else, of really treating it in a way that's not going to be productive, in which can actually make the problem worse or lead to disaster. I think that's a really important thing for leaders in this time to consider. This is not the time to assume that you know everything as the person in charge.
Right. So bricolage is making do. I mean, we see entrepreneurs do this all the time because seldom do they get all the money and resources they want when they launch.
Right.
Right. And so you're sitting there looking around, but if you have just one paradigm, so you could hand 5 different entrepreneurs the same amount of money, the same resources, and tell them to go do this same thing, and the way they go about it will be different because of the way that they frame, because the people and the creativity and imagination is different. And so within your organization, if your doors are still open and you're evolving your business model within this environment, having a heavy top-down approach can limit your outcomes and your ways to evolve and adapt to the changing financial and organizational situation that you find yourself in.
Right. I would say it will limit your ability to adapt. And I think that
I was trying to be nice. Like, don't shut your eyes here. You're going to have to fire on all cylinders, right? That means capturing the entire creativity of your organization and releasing that kind of creativity and means to be able to evolve so you can adapt better than your competitor in this environment.
Right. And this presents a bit of a challenge if, your operating style as a leader up to this point has been top down, truth and power come from above and only from above. That doesn't work very well to try to shift because people aren't going to be used to it. But I think, you have to be very explicit with the people around you and say, look, I'm going to push you to challenge me, right? If you just surround yourself with a bunch of yes people who agree with everything you say. And, I was actually working with my Navy Reserve unit a couple weeks ago, and I was making the joke that, I was going to make them all call me dear leader like Kim Jong-un, and that I was going to order them to all enthusiastically clap whenever I said anything and smile, because that's what Kim Jong-un does with his people, right? You have to like express appropriate emotion, otherwise you get, shot. And so, that's kind of the extreme example of what you don't want. You don't want people to be blindly obedient in these situations. You want that creativity. You want that dissent within a group. And people need to feel like they're not going to get, their head chopped off if they challenge you. Because otherwise you're going to limit your ability to do this bricolage, to do this sense making that has to happen in small teams and in groups and organizations when you're facing something like COVID-19.
Right. So White talks about some of 4 things that we can do to improve our resilience here. The first one of these is improvisation and bricolage. So the second one is virtual role systems. So this idea of role systems, if your organization's going on business as usual, everybody has a different role that they play, right? But when you hit this kind of event, the rules all change, right? And so how would people improvise there? One of the things you can do is socialize the different functions of the company with everyone. Not just what they do, but like how do they approach problems? Well, IT approaches problems this way or that way.
Right. And I think there's just one example of not only virtual role systems, but also a bit of the improvisation and bricolage stuff. Is if you ever seen the movie Apollo 13?
Yeah.
So there's this great scene, and we'll post a link to it, where basically something happened on the spacecraft, and the people on the ground had to figure out how they were going to help those who were way up in space and needed their assistance. They basically recreate all the different pieces that they had on the spacecraft, and said, "This is what they have up there. We need to figure out how to make this work." Right. And so this is this moment when these experts had to come together and try to combine things in a novel way in order to create a good solution. Right. So, and this happens because they did have, this not only the bricolage and the improvisation, but they also had this virtual role system in which they had, knowledge of what other people knew how to do. They had trust in each other as well. And that way they are able to be imaginative as a team.
Right. So, Phil or Nancy knows that accounting cuts the check and pays the bills, right? But if they understood how they think about certain problems in IT, in operations, on manufacturing, now if, that person can't perform that role or that function, other people kind of know what they do and how they think about things, and they can improvise. Well, hey, listen, we got one guy that knows how to operate this machine. Let's send a group of us down there. We can learn to operate the machine. There's a demand there's signaling from the environment. There's a demand in ways that you need to respond to be successful financially or organizationally or just survive in the case of a fire. And if people have the understanding of those different virtual roles, like virtually being those roles exist in their mind, they can improvise not only with the stuff, but with how to organize as a organization, as a band of people, that kind of thing.
Right. And what's interesting, and Carl Weck talks about this, is he says, even if your team is falling apart, right, and people aren't being improvisational and things are not going well in a time of crisis, if you have good knowledge of how other people see things and how other people approach things, you can imagine yourself in their shoes and say, I need to see this. I know this guy, Chris is a crazy person, and what would Chris do in this situation? How would Chris be thinking about it? And, I can imagine that, and that can break me perhaps out of my traditional way of approaching the problem and can broaden my spectrum of potential actions I can take. So we've talked about the improvisation and bricolage. We've talked about the virtual role systems. The third thing that he talks about in this article that Carl Weck talks about in terms of how we can be more resilient is the attitude of wisdom.
Right. So wisdom is different than knowledge. And just quoting from Weck, so wisdom is an attitude taken by persons towards the belief, value, knowledge, information, abilities, and skills that are held. A tendency to doubt that these are necessarily true or valid, and to doubt that they are an exhaustive set of things that could be known. So if you're wise, the expert in the room is saying X, Y, Z, A, B, C, you're asking, does this expertise really apply based on what we're sensing from the environment right now? Or is that expert just reacting according to their, field of knowledge? If you're a hammer, everything looks like a nail. Is that what's going on there?
And you're doing that not only with other people, but you're doing that with yourself.
Yeah.
Right.
Right.
And so you're not only kind of questioning, and it's this balance. It's this yin and yang of trusting expertise and trying to figure out what the best approach is, with also a healthy sense of doubt, so that you are continually reevaluating your assumptions, reevaluating your approach, so that you don't fall into the trap of falling so in love with your little plan. I love my little plan. It's a beautiful little plan. It's a tremendous plan. And then realizing that, your plan is wrong, right? You need to be questioning that. And, another thing Carl Weick says, and I don't think he says it in this article, but he says it somewhere else, is I just think it's a really good thing for leaders to be thinking about, especially in these times of crisis, is argue as though you are right, but listen as if you are wrong. And, because people don't want you to stand, like as a leader, people are going to really be listening to you. And you don't want to be standing up there and saying, well, I have no clue what's going on. Let's just figure it out. That's the wrong approach. However, when you have some reasonable sense of what could work and you put that out to your followers, you should also be at the same time sensing from the environment and saying, we're going to keep evaluating this. This is what we know now. We may get more information. This is the approach that makes the most sense now based upon X, Y, or Z, but we're going to reevaluate. And actually, so I'm here in Ohio, and our governor is pretty much across the board being praised right now for how he has approached, how he and his public health director, Dr. Amy Acton, have been handling this whole thing. And he was one of the first people to say, this is not a normal situation. We've got to lock stuff down. We got to be braced for the long haul here. And at the same time, revising things as more information comes out, which has been good, and I think is showing this attitude of wisdom.
Right. And so as a leader, when you're curating that attitude of wisdom, if you just come in to brief, all right, guys, this is what's going on, this is what we're going to do about it, that's not actually eliciting that improvisation or people's creativities with virtual role systems or whatever. And if you have that type of environment generally, which can be appropriate in a very process-driven organization, if that's what's socialized before, you have to signal as a leader that, hey, not only am I giving you freedom to improvise, I'm wanting you to improvise. I need you to talk to me. So the tone that you set at the top or when you sit down with your team is generally one of competence and that you're familiar with what's going on. But you could shift and say, I expect and I need to hear your ideas now. These are ways in which you can signal that, hey, the paradigm has changed. I am fallible as the leader. I need you guys to help us as an organization be successful.
Right. So it's this balance between, as Weick puts it, extreme confidence and extreme caution. He says, extreme confidence and extreme caution can both destroy what organizations most need in changing times, namely curiosity, openness, and complex sensing. The overconfident shun curiosity because they feel they know most of what there is to know. The overcautious shun curiosity for fear it will only deepen their uncertainties. Both the cautious and the confident are close-minded, which means neither makes good judgments. It is this sense in which wisdom, which avoids extremes, improves adaptability. And that's really what we need from our leaders right now as we're dealing with this pandemic.
Yeah, and you'll see this in the Agile literature, right?
Sure.
Do we want to be, there's always a continuity between, overconfidence and overcautiousness. Well, who would be either of those extremes? And so it's a false dichotomy to choose between those. Like between confidence and caution, we're right here, and you put your X somewhere in the middle of that line to define how you're going to start going about things, right?
Right. And, this also goes back to that whole idea we talked about earlier about, don't try to fight this just like the last war. Avoid falling into these patterns of thinking that, this is just like what we experienced previously. Now, Maybe it is, but maybe it isn't. And that's the balance between confidence and caution that you really have to strike.
Right. So the last one, respectful interaction.
Right. So, this is where sense making is probably best thought of as a team sport. This is not something that we only do in our own heads. We make sense of our environment through the interactions that we have with others, especially face-to-face interaction with other people, because there is so much more information that is conveyed and meaning that is that we try to create together when we are breathing the same air, or at least can see other people and can understand, how much confidence they have in their statements and so forth, right? That's why being in the same space, if possible, is really important. So sense making is a team sport.
Right. And since you've defined rules previously and the org is operated in a certain way, or the team is operated in a certain way, you actually got to dump that old kind of thinking. So you're not coming and just, if how you were operating as an organization was working fine despite COVID and other types of these kind of Vuja Day experiences, then you wouldn't even be interested in what's going on. You don't even need to sense everything. You're successful. This is just a blip on the radar. But when something comes and disrupts things so much, you actually have to shed those patterns temporarily. So you get everybody in a room let's pretend we know nothing. And then you start through some of these thinking type patterns. All right. Then you got kind of maybe a solution or a way to act or how you're going to behave based on what you sense. Then bring back the old thinking and maybe do a sanity check on it. Right. But this interaction has to be respectful or you'll kill it. You'll kill that creativity.
Right. And another thing to consider is that in these times of crisis, in these times when nothing seems to be making a whole lot of sense, this can be emotionally jarring for people on your team. And they sometimes, can freeze and, be just kind of reeling from what's happening. And in those situations, in order to get the best out of those people in that moment, you really have to be intentional about helping them to share and say, look, this is crazy for all of us. Acknowledge that it's tough and say, look, at the same time, we really need to all be firing on all cylinders here. We all have great ideas. Let's start to share them and just get that conversation going and get people talking about things to help to really kind of move towards something more productive. Because I can just tell you, dealing, for example, in various military situations I've been in, where something unexpected happens, sometimes people do kind of, are in shock for a few moments and they're trying to figure out what needs to happen next. And, this is where you have to look people in the eye, assure them that things are going to be okay, even if you're not super confident about that reality, and say, look, let's figure this out together. And we really all need to pull together and do it. And even, a little bit of humor can even, and research does suggest this helps, can even break kind of that cycle of emotional tension that sometimes occurs.
Yeah. And so, one of the things I keep missing here or mentioning here is that the leader needs to. But we've all seen scenarios where the leader's frozen up.
Right.
He's the one that's mentally toast and not curating the type of sense making that needs to happen so that you can respond. Yep. So this is if you're mid-level in an organization, if you're lower, you can bring out these things, bricolage and improvisation, attitudes of wisdom. You can suggest if you don't have that functional authority. It's like, hey, maybe we lay out all our options and see what we can improvise. That can jar that leader into, oh, yeah, so I know what I can do now. In the Army, we see this kind of stuff because we'll have cameras set up to review teams. So we'll practice those teams on how to move with their weapons in a small unit or whatever. And then somebody in the scenario will have a bang go off, or there's a casualty that presents itself while you round the corner in a training scenario. Well, I thought we were going to go kill terrorists in this training scenario. Now we've got like an American casualty. Right. We throw those kinds of events into these training scenarios because we want to practice and rehearse bricolage, attitude of wisdoms, respectful interactions, these kinds of things. They'll happen. So if you're low or mid-roll, check. If your organization's frozen up, you can actually lead from below on these types of items.
Right. I think that is extremely important. And, when I say leader, I'm oftentimes referring to, just the person who is kind of starting that social process of interaction and movement towards some sort of goal. So that leadership role can certainly shift around within the group. And what you're highlighting too, in terms of describing those training scenarios, I think really is an interesting feature of the military in which, people who are outside the military kind of sometimes have this stereotype that think, oh, well, a bunch of like kind of robots who do what they're told and so forth. And it really couldn't be farther from the truth. And it really, especially in dynamic types of environments, the military really tries, and a lot of this research actually comes from the military on how we can better make decisions, and be more creative and improvisational in the face of unexpected events, because our lives depend upon it in those circumstances. It's really important. And even from a planning standpoint, right? We do things called red teaming. So, for example, you come up with this plan about how you're going to do something, and then you have a group of people who are designated to be the naysayers and the dissenters, and to poke holes in your plan and so forth, and to kind of drive that creativity. And this really requires this respectful interaction. It requires people to have trust in each other, requires them to be honest, and also have some self-respect. So don't self-censor. If you have an idea, you have to say it. You have that, not only that ability, but that obligation to do it. And speaking your mind, listening to people along the way.
Right. And, we're using these intense examples, fire, training to fight terrorism, that could give some people some tension maybe in their shoulders as nobody's shooting at us right now, which is
right.
Great. But that being said, the chaos to our organizations and the fiscal outcomes are nuts right now. And so we can dial into some of that kind of thinking paradigm as we start to figure out, well, what can we do to thrive? If everybody else in my industry is on pause right now, waiting for some kind of fiscal bailout, what could we do? I don't see, a lot of that conversation out on social media. Everybody's they're still focusing on the doom and gloom. They're like a lieutenant stuck in a situation. And, now under the hood, some of this stuff can be going on, but I'm not seeing a whole lot of people talking about it. So when this kind of chaos happens, dial into these, respectful interaction, bricolage, improvisation, but also realize if you decide to do nothing, that in and of itself is a choice, So, and that's why sensing is so perfect. So if you see something bad, like a fire, if you just start running and you don't stop to take a sense of like, am I actually running? Am I in the middle of a fire? Maybe there's fire on all sides. Am I actually running? If you don't stop to do some of these sense-making behaviors, your response isn't going to be as calibrated as it might be.
Right. And I think your point about, nothing is a choice. We need to be mindful of that. I think, the way I always think of it is, like the one of my favorite rock band trios, Rush, said in one of their songs, if you choose not to decide, you still have made a choice. And this is very true in organizations as well. And in these moments of crises, sometimes you have to do something, see what happens, and then learn from it quickly, right? So this is the act, sense and respond type of modality that maybe you have to do to get yourself out of chaos. And so, when the rules of the game seem to have changed in all kinds of different ways, sometimes you just have to try something and see what happens to learn from it.
Right. And sometimes, honestly, you're surrounded by fire. There's always this fantasy that there's always going to be a good outcome. Well, this person did bad because there was a bad outcome. But maybe the options only were bad, horrible, and god awful, right? And the fact that there was a bad outcome was actually the best that could happen. If you're stuck on the moon by yourself, there's no spaceship in sight, and you got 5 seconds of air left, well, I mean, you could start some bricolage or something, but sometimes you're just hosed, right? Like we got to be honest about that, right? So, but sense making is something, if you want to shape your outcome as much as you can, sense making is an important part of that.
That's well said. And I do want to be clear that I don't think that we as a society or organizations are necessarily completely hosed in this situation. But it is a very unique. It's a unique and difficult one for most organizations right now, and for a lot of people personally. So maybe we could turn our attention now to what are some of the emerging new tasks and new roles for management due to the emergence of COVID-19.
Right. So the better organizations I'm talking to and seeing right now are doing their disaster plans and stuff like that, in as much as they are. And they're like, okay, well, this is what we do. Or they're round the table, we've got to lay off 40% of our workforce. And they're going through this. And people kind of know how to move those levers, make those plays, right? But what I don't see a whole lot of, and obviously this is just anecdotally, I haven't done a national survey on any of this kind of stuff, is the sense-making stuff. So an emerging new task and role for management is being an enabler of sense-making. So you got to understand it, and then you also have to start, at least in that next tier of leadership within your organization, start enabling and training on some of these items.
Right. And, one way to do this is just to communicate what your sense-making process is. How will you, as team members, as people, shift and change? What are the ways in which this environment is a fluid one? And really moving toward, and this is probably a good thing for all of us to learn anyway, regardless of our operating environment, but moving towards this new normal of sensing and responding in a rapid way to what's going on.
Right. And, depending on how big your organization is, a 5-person team in a garage writing code is going to be able to sense and respond differently than a 60,000 some odd person organization, right?
Right. That's certainly true. And another way to think about this entire kind of leadership process that has to occur in terms of being an enabler of sense making is that, you can kind of think of leadership, especially in times like we are in right now, as the process of organizing the ambiguity around us. We as humans, we don't like ambiguity. We don't like uncertainty. And a leader's job is to try to facilitate that process of organizing it. And so there's a paper that I published about 10 years ago, actually with Cliff Scott, whom I mentioned earlier in the episode, where we analyzed a bunch of near-miss reports where people almost had an accident happen. And this was also with firefighters, but looking at their communication patterns and what they did in those different reports. And, a few different interesting, ideas that emerged from that is that this process of organizing ambiguity around us as a leader involves a couple different activities. One of those activities is helping to frame the situation, and as a leader, as a group, trying to gauge and assess the level of risk that you're facing, trying to use some of the successes and failures that you face in other types of situations to try to inform what you're doing, but not being so married to them that you're going to treat every war like the last war, right?
Right.
And then, so from framing, and then there's, these aren't necessarily like a sequential. These are all kind of happening at the same time. Then adjusting, right? So, maintaining your awareness of what's going on, but also remembering that, you could be wrong. Your assumptions might be wrong. And remaining continuously poised for change. Remembering that, okay, it may feel really good to get your plan in place and so forth, but you also need to question it and realize that, hey, does this plan still work? Or is there something else we need to be doing? And then the other piece of this organizing ambiguity is actually borrowing from a phrase that Carl Weick uses in another paper called heedful interrelating, right? And this is about communicating in a way that really helps the team, the group, to better make sense of what's going on. And remembering that, instead of trying to do this by yourself, remembering that you're engaging with others as you're trying to recognize what's going on, and realizing that what you do can have some unintended consequences. So, this can help you in these times of change and crisis to make some better decisions, to take some action. And that's going to create more ambiguity probably, but you're going to have to then go through the process of organizing that as well.
Right. So you start the sense-making process. You're framing, you're adjusting, you're heedfully interrelating, right? Then you're making some kind of decision, and then the environment tells you something back, and you're like, oh, this is starting to make sense, or this looks promising. Then you got to feed that back into your org so they can, bricolage and improvise with that new piece of knowledge, that new piece of sensing. And so slowly, the image of what's really going on emerges, and you're able to navigate and chart your course, right?
Right. And so I think just to kind of pull out some of the specifics here, you got to remember in these situations that you don't know everything. That's not your job to know everything, and you shouldn't pretend like you do. You should try to find and use the experts that are around you. When people disagree and dissent with the team, embrace that. Thank people for doing it.
Right. And you don't want to claim that the mission's accomplished too soon, right?
Right.
Things start, and it can feel that way because everything was super chaotic. And then all of a sudden your sense making is starting to reduce some of that chaos. Well, you may feel, it may just be the eye of the storm, right? So you need to keep that sense making thing active. And actually, it should be active at all times. You don't have to have a crisis to maintain the sensing, because the crisis may actually be your competitor is beating the pants off you, right? That kind of thing.
Right. Yeah. All of these things that we're talking about here in this episode about sense making are just as relevant in a competitive, ambiguous business environment as they are in the world right now dealing with a pandemic. These are all about sensing and responding appropriately. A couple other specifics I think that organizations and leaders need to be considering right now is you've got to establish some structure for controlling, and commanding and helping to facilitate this sense making, regarding COVID-19 in particular. Your communication flow and your reporting to your people. People are going to be I know I have been extraordinarily attuned to new information. You're probably looking at the news more. You're really listening to what people say, and that communication flow and that reporting should be it should be frequent, and it should be as clear as possible.
Yeah, especially when a lot of you guys have remote workforces right now.
Right, right, and so you've got to put together some extra effort there. So my good colleague and friend Cliff Scott, he just recently posted. He wrote something for his university, the University of North Carolina at Charlotte, that they posted on their website, all about just some key things to remember, some key principles for leaders communicating in times of uncertainty. And we'll post a link to this in the show note, and I'll just give you the real highlights here. But he says that there's a danger in crisis, but also key opportunities for strategic influence. Leaders can influence how people interpret situations, intentionally and unintentionally, kind of like we were talking about here with sense making. When leaders don't address uncertainty, employees may use rumor and speculation to fill in the blanks. That's an important one, right?
And they do. They do.
They do. Yeah.
You would do it if you're in their spot, right?
For sure. Right. We because we are information seeking, creatures. Another thing that Cliff writes here, he says, don't assume you know everything you need to make decisions, right? He talks about how research shows that the most reliable, responsive organizations are those who allow decisions to be influenced by the experts, regardless of rank, right? So this isn't a hierarchical thing. And then he wraps up by talking about how you should acknowledge how complicated the situation is for your people and their families. Don't disregard the human element here. This is tough for people. It's tough for for people dealing with being isolated, for people losing their jobs, for people maybe dealing with the possibility or the reality of layoffs. All of those types of events and circumstances are really tough for folks, and you need to acknowledge that as a leader.
Right. And so communication flow often and clear, that's super important in setting the tone. Lots of times, we were talking with a CEO yesterday, actually, that's about to lay off a decent chunk of his workforce. And that's challenging for him. But if you're on like wave 4 of layoffs or something and you haven't been clear and communicative, not only is that going to hurt your brand, it's going to hurt your perception, people's perception of you as leader. It's going to reduce trust in that organization. So go ahead and take charge. Make sure that communication flow is often and clear. Also, you might need to make some new policies as needed here. Work from home policies is one. But don't be so attached to them. Use that as a bit of a probe. Okay, so here's our current idea on this policy and how we're going to execute now. We will update and revise as needed. You can have your org give you feedback on that. How are these policies working? Okay, well, let's update. And then that will just pop that into our communication flow that happens.
Right. And actually, I think a good example of this from my world right now is the Navy. So the Navy has done a good job, in my estimation, of quickly putting out official information about here's what needs to happen with these types of circumstances. Here's some new policies and procedures we need to follow, and very quickly revising those and putting out new information along the way. It's not like people aren't having to guess about a lot right now,
right?
Which is very helpful. And that's part of this communication piece.
Right. So while you're going through this kind of stuff, you want to think about the strategic implications for your organization. Is this something to where you're not going to be a going concern anymore? Or you can't meet demand due to lack of workers? If everybody at Amazon is out sick, well, that's a huge impact. Some people only get their diapers through Amazon, if they live way out in the middle of nowhere. So you need to think about those things and make sure that you're not just reacting to the fire at hand, you're also keeping the idea of where you're placed in the business environment and what strategies that's going to mean for you as you start sensing your way forward.
Right. So there's a Navy SEAL whom I know pretty well and work with and work for, actually. And he says, there's a lot of kind of 1 meter and 5 meter targets right now, and things that are right in front of us.
Right.
And at the same time, we've got to hit those 1 meter and 5 meter targets, those things that are close to us. But we also need to, as you were talking about, think about what's happening long term and what this might mean in the future. A few other things I'm hearing from some of my HR friends is, you've also got to not only create those new policies perhaps in your organization, but I hope as of this recording, this has been going on for a couple weeks now in the United States, but ensure that your people, if they are for whatever reason still coming to work, make sure they know what they're supposed to do if they're sick or they have symptoms, in terms of reporting and all that kind of those types of actions. If you have people who are in your office, make sure that there's posters up saying you need to wash your hands and so forth. You may actually in your organization be called upon or be actively involved in contact tracing. So if you have someone who comes down with COVID-19, you need to be prepared to go have somebody who can help go through that process of, who was that person in contact with.
You got it. And then on a positive note, because some of this stuff seems kind of tense and maybe, a little scary, but this is not just a time to maintain your culture. If you have built a really good culture, but you can use this as a time to enhance your culture.
Mm-hmm.
Since we're forced into sense-making behaviors, if we're doing this right, you can use it to bake this into your organization everywhere. So that when you're out of this type of crisis, that your company is sense-making writ large at all times. Hey, did you know that our competitor's doing this? Oh, you might not have captured that before if you hadn't curated a sense-making function within your organization.
Right, right. So we have the opportunity here, perhaps, to learn some of these sense-making skills and to actually create organizations that are more resilient in the future.
Right. Ben, so how about a recap?
Sure. So today we talked all about sense-making, leadership, and COVID-19. And in that, we talked about this idea of the collapse of sense-making and how organizations can be fragile if they're not doing this well. We talked about some ways in which we can lead the charge, so to speak, and how people within organizations and the organizations overall can support that. And then we talked about some of these emerging new tasks and roles for management due to this new reality that we're all dealing with regard to COVID-19. Thanks for listening to the Indigo Podcast. If you like this podcast, please consider helping us by rating us on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen, telling your friends about us, having us on your podcast, or mentioning us on social media. Our website is www.indigopodcast.com, where you can access more information about us and this episode. Thanks again, and we look forward to talking with you again soon.